And let's reflect then on Daniel Levy's departure from Spurs. That was a little earlier this month, and there's a really in-depth piece which I would recommend to listeners by Jack Pitt-Brooke in The Athletic. And you and I have, I don't know if crossed swords, but we've debated the merits of Daniel Levy before, and I know you have some insight into Spurs. The piece by Jack in The Athletic talks about his fairly brutal departure from Tottenham, saying that it's familiar to those in the corporate world, in that he was effectively told that his job was terminated after nearly a quarter of a century at Spurs. And he and his wife, who also worked for the club, were told that they couldn't even go and retrieve their personal belongings from the club's training ground, which was Levy's pride and joy, that he had built up this training ground, which has got facilities that are the envy of many around the country and indeed in Europe. So it was all a bit swift. It was all a bit brutal. He clearly takes credit for not only building that training ground, but the magnificent new stadium at Tottenham Hotspur, which allows Spurs to bring in money year round, not just from soccer, but from American football, concerts as well. Yet there was a huge part of the Spurs fan base that was not happy with Daniel Levy and celebrated his departure because he was seen as a man who did not put football, or the glory game, as Spurs fans like to think of it, didn't put it first. What's your take on him?
Um, well, that's all true. I think overall, over that long period of time, he has had a transformational effect on Tottenham. And I always say, judge an owner, judge a chief executive by the state that they leave the club in compared to the state they took it over in. And if you look back to when Daniel took over the club, mid-table in a stadium that even by the standards of the turn of the century was pretty antiquated, revenue-wise going nowhere. And he leaves the club having just won a European title, having over the last 10 years finished, I think, on average about sixth in the Premier League. And with this huge revenue generating machine, which is going to make it easier for anyone who comes subsequent to press on and do a great job. It's going to be really difficult for him because I think that Spurs are about to go from strength to strength, and that will be he will have torn feelings about that because, and I have some sort of experience of this, you get no credit for it when it happens, despite the fact that you're the one who sorted out all the problems. You know, when I look at, a lot of Sunderland fans still lambast me for my time running their club, but I took it over when it was bust and losing £27 million a year, having just had the three worst seasons in English football history. I think they won 9 games over 3 seasons, something terrible like that. And here we are 6 years later, and they're in 7th or 8th place in the Premier League. And Sunderland fans would love to think that that was all achieved in the last couple of months, but it's not. It's built by laying foundations, by appointing people, by setting a culture, by getting things right, by bringing in the right sort of people at sort of middle management level, and all these things go to creating success. And I think that Daniel has done so much of that, and it will now very likely happen. Why would it happen now when it didn't happen under him? Well, probably because there is a slight law of diminishing returns when it comes to these types of jobs, which is to say that the things that you're really good at, you get right, and the club gets the benefit of those things because you make those decisions and good stuff happens. So as you say, the training ground, the stadium, the revenue generation, all that kind of stuff that he's spent the last 15 years focused on. But the things that you're not so good on, unfortunately, don't tend to go away. And in some ways, they tend to get worse because the organization isn't able to push on and breathe and move in those directions. Now, a really, 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 really wise chief executive, and I'm not claiming to be one myself, but there we are, recognizes their weaknesses and delegates in those areas and finds ways of working around their own weaknesses. And probably maybe if, a strong chairman would do that as well. But the reality is he's been largely operating the club solo for most of that time. Joe Lewis has been the senior shareholder, but a pretty silent one and not a presence at the club at all. When I was a consultant there, you never even heard his name being mentioned. It wasn't like, I saw Daniel and Joe. No, it was Daniel. Everything was Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. And I was advising the then commercial director, the late and great Simon Bamber. And Simon was an extremely senior person in the commercial world. before and even during his time at Spurs, he sat on other boards and all this type of stuff. He was about as senior as it got. Unfortunately, departed us too early. But what was interesting was that even Simon couldn't really make decisions. He wasn't really allowed to make decisions. He was basically there to funnel stuff to Daniel. It would then sit on Daniel's desk and wait for Daniel or his right hand woman Donna to decide what direction they wanted to go in. So it really was an organization that was sort of all oriented towards Daniel Levy. And that came with great strengths when it came to the focus required to get the new stadium built. And it was around that time that I was at Spurs. But also with some weaknesses, which is, the ability sometimes, as I say, to recognize the stuff you're not quite maybe instinctively as good at and to delegate and find ways around it. I don't believe at all in any way, shape, or form that Daniel Levy did not care about winning football matches. I just no chance. I mean, he threw everything he possibly could at it, appointing managers left, right, and centre, signing players. Everything he was doing was to try and create success on the football pitch. He knew that that was the thing that ultimately would turn Spurs into the biggest behemoth possible. But it was something that he just found a bit elusive. And in the end, you have to draw the conclusion that that particular bit of the job wasn't really his strength.
No, and if you're a Spurs fan, I mean, of course, you understand that the club is a business and it has to be run as a business. And you have to say, from that side of things, Spurs was run incredibly efficiently. Many clubs have fallen victim to the transformation to a new stadium, and Spurs have possibly the best new stadium in English football. I've not actually visited it myself, but the pictures look magnificent and I can't wait to go there. But clearly, in terms of revenue generation, it's a great thing for Spurs. But
not just revenue generation, Adrian. Not when you go there, what you will find is it is a proper football stadium in a way that the Emirates is not. The Emirates feels like a multi-use stadium. The Tottenham's White Hart Lane feels like a proper football stadium. It's steep, it's tight to the pitch. You really feel like you're involved in the game. And that's why I'm saying that, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater in reviewing Daniel Levy. It wasn't just a revenue generation thing. That was the project of a man with a deep, deep passion for football.
Yeah, no, and I'm willing to accept that. But you look back at his time. Now, his time crossed over with the arrival of oil money, particularly at Manchester City. I think it's had less immediate impact at Newcastle United, but at Manchester City, it made Manchester City a global force on the field of play. And of course, you had Spurs neighbours Chelsea, which I'm sure would have really annoyed Spurs fans. Chelsea picking up 20 honours in that time, funded by most of that period anyway, by Abramovich's money. So you can argue that the top two places in the Premier League, if not fully blocked out, then they were extremely difficult to achieve. But for a club whose, if you like, self-mythology is about glory, and we may talk about how realistic that is, but nevertheless, that is part of the club's myth, the kind of the story the fans tell themselves. The glory was distinctly lacking, wasn't it? They won, of course, the Europa League last year, but before that, their only trophy in Levy's time was a League Cup back in 2008. They did reach a Champions League final, and under Pochettino, they were regular contenders and sometimes participants in the Champions League. So, I mean, it wasn't all bad by most club standards. This is a pretty decent rate of return. But I think Spurs will measure themselves against Chelsea, who won 20 trophies over that period. And the purpose of the money is to generate a successful football team. Certainly, that's how the fans would see it. And that's why, in the harshest analysis, even if you can applaud and appreciate much of what he did at Tottenham, that's where I think the fans would say, thanks, Daniel, but you didn't really do the job we wanted you to do.
Yeah, I think the problem is that the whole glory thing, actually, if you look back in Spurs' history, is not so much about winning stuff. It's about playing with style. And if
Mm.
the wins, if the trophies come, then that's great. But the one non-negotiable is playing with style. And I think if you look back over that time, he did somewhat swing from one way to the other. He would swing from appointing a more typical Tottenham type manager who would play in a sort of more attacking, swashbuckling style. But then the pressure would come on to win something, and he'd go and appoint Mourinho. Then he'd go back again and appoint someone like Ange, and then come back again and appoint, you know, somebody who is more doer, and there just to sort of try and win something. And I think that probably is the sign of a slight a communication problem, right? Which is you really ideally want to set your course and communicate that. It's actually, funny enough, something that I think our current prime minister struggles with. You have to set out what your stall is and what your message is and where you're going and that type of stuff. And then from that moment on, you have to pursue it. And you have to be pretty consistent in pursuing it. And you have to persuade your stakeholders, in this case the fans, that that is actually something which is in their interest. And I think just the swinging around got a bit repetitive and a bit sort of, it just didn't feel like the organization quite knew what it was anymore. Are we just a massive club trying to compete at the top table, and then we hire managers who are just of that kind, even if it's pretty pragmatic and dull at times? Or are we Tottenham Hotspur? Are we Tottenham Hotspur, who sometimes one week will win 5-0, the next week might lose 3-0? And that's the way which Spurs has historically been. And it sort of felt like it sort of lost its identity. But as I said, overall, that club is now in a phenomenal position to succeed. And I suspect it is about to succeed. And as I said, that will be very heavily down to Daniel Levy, but it will leave him with somewhat conflicted feelings.
Yeah, and probably very little applause as well. Should that happen,
Yeah,
I think they've got
exactly.
a,
Yeah.
I think they've got a terrific manager now in Thomas Frank, and at the weekend, got a Spurs fan mate who joins us in a WhatsApp conversation about football, and he said Spurs only need to beat Wolves, who have lost 5 out of 5, in order to go second. Dot dot dot. We knew what would happen next. He implied, i.e., Spurs would be Spursy, and for a long period in the game against Wolves, they were losing 1-0, and that would have been the ultimate Spursy thing to do. But I think there is a new resolve under Thomas Frank, and they equalised very late on. They may have been fortunate to get a draw, but it was a draw. They didn't lose. And that is, I think, the sign that maybe under Thomas Frank, Spurs have got a bit more resilience about them than some of the more recent teams.